Hi guys! So today we're taking a look at the final type of the series. This is the TiNe type. So the TiNe type is most similar to the FINE type, which we saw earlier, but is also in between that and the TISE type. But at the same time, it's also adjacent to the NETI type. So the Vultology should fit in between those three types. So we're going to explore now what that Vultology looks like and also what psychology comes hand in hand when we see that Vultology. So the first sample that we have here is Thales. He is a volunteer, and so thank you, Thales, for allowing me to add this video here. All right, so let's go. So first we're going to focus on the Vultology, disengaging eyes, neutralized cheeks, a little bit of a perk up there, then going back down to neutralization, rigid body. So you have the JI there in effect, and you have the TI impersonality, the kind of a stoic demeanor with not a lot of affect, and continuing this long, super long pauses. You're gonna see this a lot, by the way, in this video with the TiNes. So just be prepared for that. They take their time internally processing a lot before they come out at you. As for his eyes, he's mostly facing away, but when he turns over to look at us, you can see here the naive quality of the eyes, the way that they're gently embedded and they have that bright element to the upper eyelids. His Vultology is most similar to the FINEs we saw earlier. For example, here Frida, who also has these disengages down, meticulous hands, fluttery, naive eye tension. Now, as for his psychology, this video is in Portuguese, but it has English subtitles, so we're going to rely on those. Now, this first question that he's answering is, what would you like to be famous for? So that's the context. So ever since he was a kid, he had a certain desire. Notice the momentum halting, very clear, strong neutralization. I was inspired by some symbols, people who symbolized for me. So the people that they changed the way we, the society, see the world. Okay. So I always had an interest in this. If not this for society, it can be for me. But I would like to be famous for something related to this, that I can understand the world and make an observation about it. Maybe create a certain model of representation of reality that can be efficient. Would like to be famous for making an observation, a model, or representation of reality. I don't know if efficient is the right word, but that corresponds to it. And also, again, the long pauses. I don't know the right word, but shocking in some way. Because it would make other presuppositions that we have about the world, we would have to discard or reorganize them. Discarding or reorganizing presuppositions we have about our world. Shocking. Cool. So he'd like to come up with something that, by the very idea of it, it changes the way that we perceive and understand what presuppositions we use to describe reality. So this next question was, what do most people not know about you? And he says, it's an effed up question. I think that what most people don't know about me is mainly what's going on through my head. Because, I don't know, there are always a lot of ideas, analysis passing through it, maybe. Most people don't know what's going on in my head. Lots of analyses. Now that is almost an identical answer to a question that was asked to the FINEs. If you guys remember Selena here, for example.
What's something most people don't know about you? Most people don't know shit about me. Yeah, I'm very misunderstood. But that's okay. I don't know if I would.
Right. So notice that both of these types, they are highly introverted. You can see just in their mannerisms, the way that they pause so long, which is a testament to how much ratio of time they spend inside their mind versus out in the world. Even to just articulate something is very strenuous, and they are very quick to retreat back, which is part of why most people are going to be completely unaware of any of their mental happenings. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Now we're going to move on to our second example, and this is also a volunteer. This is Isaac, so thank you, Isaac, for allowing us to use your video.
Actually have a career that'd be genuine.
So voltologically, we see the delicate pinching from the JI hands. Again, a rigid posture, neutralized emotion from the face, more pausing with the eyes disengaging down.
Because I don't get annoyed at too many things.
And the voice, notice the voice.
But I have a lot of small things maybe that I would get annoyed at.
Yeah, the flat voice, the dry emotional energy, and the rigid JI body. Now, as far as the eyes go, you can see them when he looks forward here. They also have a more naive quality to them, just as we see here with Thales. So similar energy, similarly dry, stoic, unflappable energy to both of them, and the rigidity of the body. Okay, let's listen to what he has to say.
If I could actually have a career that I'd be genuinely good at and that I could enjoy, it would probably be like philosophy.
Okay.
Or physics, I don't know. Something along the lines of that, at least.
Okay.
That one's so hard just because I don't get annoyed at too many things.
The question was, what annoys you the most?
But I have a lot of small things maybe that I would get annoyed at. Maybe just one little thing would be, I think, when people don't let me try to think things over or try to communicate my point fully at, you know, in a conversation type of setting.
Right, which would make sense if, as a TI lead, there's a lot of processing time, and therefore with an interlocutor, there may not be enough space for the TINE to insert their own position if they're not being given the space or the time for it. So something annoying, not being given enough time to think things over in conversation.
Probably nature.
He says probably nature. The question here was, what's something that you find beautiful?
And in a really big sense, at least, as something that's completely big, external from you. Like if you go on a nature walk and you go up a mountain and then you look over the view of this whole cavern or ravine, whatever what you hiked, I think there's something that's probably really beautiful to that, at least. I don't...
So most beautiful would be nature in a big way, peering out from a canyon or ravine.
At least I don't have anything super philosophical to say from that, at least off the top of my head, but just something to see something bigger out than from yourself.
Something bigger out there from yourself.
And yeah, and even just to expand on that, probably even the universe as well.
I'm going to add here the universe.
Why is there something rather than nothing? I don't think people know that question, or know how to answer that question. Well, they can answer the question, but I don't think anybody actually knows. Unless you're religious, which I am not religious, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
So he says he's non-religious, and nobody can answer the question of why there is something, unless they go for a religious answer, but I guess he doesn't find them compelling answers.
That's tough, because you're going to get backlash either way with what...
The question here is, what would you like to be famous for?
Whatever what you do
So he says you're going to get backlash whatever you do.
Way. So, I don't know, whether you're a scientist and people say you're non-religious, or other scientists say you're crazy for coming up with theories like Einstein.
Well, he's not answering the question, but in a way he is answering it by proxy of giving examples like coming up with a theory like Einstein.
Yeah, I don't know. I would just probably not want to be famous and just live in a cabin far away in the woods.
Fame would cause trouble. A theory like Einstein's would upset religious or non-religious people. Like, I would rather just live in a cabin in the woods. So again, we see a connection here with Isaac and the FINEs from earlier. In fact, Melinda here from the FINEs was asked the very same question, because I have a questionnaire that I give out when people submit their videos, and her response was here.
Well, honestly, I don't want to be famous. I like to be like blend into the background.
Yeah. So exactly the same sort of idea as him, both wanting to blend into the background and be private. Notice these two types are very similar to each other. Psychologically, they both feel as though in their heads they know something, and they are not understood in the way that they understand themselves in their heads. And they're very private people. They don't want to be famous. They don't want to be seen, which, by the way, is part of the reason why, I think you might imagine, I'm mostly using volunteers for both of these samples, because they are not prone to be in fame because they are so self-kept. They're so hermetic in some way. And so it takes a lot of work and development for them to kind of step out of that cabin and kind of meet the world, which actually relates to the next sample here, which happens to be me. Now, this is a younger video of me when my development was standard development, which is to say just TI conscious with the other 3 functions unconscious. Now, remember we discussed that there are 8 development levels that are possible. And in this series of videos, we're just looking at the standard developments. So where just TI is conscious in the TINEs. So at this period in time of my life, I am not a standard development TINE. I have developed FE considerably, which puts me in this development, which I call the polarized development. And if you see me in these videos right now, I am in a kind of presentation mode where I'm over amplifying the FE in order to do a good job being an articulator, which is what the JE functions do. But this is what I look like in a more standard development, let's say over 10 years ago. So let's watch here for a moment. So we have disengaging eyes, neutralization of affect. The eyes have the naive quality to them here. You can see the gentle embedding. Well, really, you can see them on mines right now as well. The scaling here follows the SI and NE pattern of being mainly concentrated towards the center. More disengaging, very rigid posture. Fluttery eyes, you can see there. Let's see that again. Let's see the eyes. Yep, blinking and scattering. It's very NE eyes. So you have the NE eyes, you have the JI neutralization. Yep. So very similar to what we saw with these two. Very similar Vultology to all 3 of us here. Now taking a look at the psychology here.
I didn't read anything that led me to those conclusions. I actually didn't. I deliberately would take only limited amount of information.
So what I'm talking about here is my philosophical conclusions and I say that I didn't read anything that led me to the conclusions. They were kind of self-directed, self-arrived. I was very much a not an autodidact, because that still assumes taking in information and books, but I was more of like a individualist of the mind, where I prefer to do things myself rather than having other people insert in me ideas. And so it's more of an autonomy of thought that I was insistent on making sure my ideas come from me only. So I'm going to put here, I didn't read anything that led me to those conclusions. Autonomy of thought, okay.
And like the more information there is, the more it muddles things.
Okay.
So a lot of what I've done in life is try to sort out what the relevant information is, and what it means, and sort of specialize in what kind of things I'm looking for. So it hasn't been about data absorption as much as it's about the criticism of that data. And
so sorting out the relevant information from the irrelevant and understanding what it means. Okay, let me add that here. So not about data absorption, but the criticism of that data. So if I can speak on behalf of the younger me here, I would try to narrow my question and isolate like a certain kind of inquiry, and then hone in on what might be essentially the right answer to that specific question, and data that is not relevant to that wouldn't be accounted for in the examination. So it's a very kind of hyper-specific investigation process. Let me condense these two here. That's better. Okay.
I mean, like at age 11 or 12, you know, I came to the deduction that eventually ended up being called something else before I even knew it had a name, which is nihilism. And then again, like at 17 or 18, I came to the deduction, without introduction of any material, that was later known to me as determinism.
So at age 12, deduced nihilism. At age 17, deduced determinism. Right, so and what I'm describing here is this sort of autonomy of thought, independently reflecting on reality. These conclusions were arrived at prior to reading any books on the matter or any opinions on the matter. Yeah.
And now it seems that I've come to the conclusion, which is really Zen Buddhism. So
in early adulthood, concluded on Zen Buddhism.
Because when I examine my own philosophy, I come to the conclusion that there really is a fundamental bias in it. That there's two biases.
So when I examine my philosophy, there are two fundamental biases.
There's two biases that are actually unjustified. The first one is that, you know, by the very nature of the structure of my psyche, it has the bias that absolute reality does exist. That there is an objective reality outside of my mind, and, you know, that dispels things like solipsism and such. And it's not even a question of how should I say, of probability. It's like, it's not like, well, you know, you should entertain it as a possibility that it might absolute reality might exist, but you don't really know. No, there's almost like an intrinsic faith that there just is. It's kind of a given. Because it's like, even if the reality is this illusion I'm living in, that is the reality in the sense. It wasn't at the level that I thought it was at.
So bias, absolute reality does exist as a kind of a priori assumption of my mind. That's very interesting, right? What I'm describing here at this age was essentially, and like in a kind of metacognition way, reflecting on my own thoughts and realizing that I have fundamental biases that I'm operating through that I can't seem to say no to. So there's this third person element to my own reflection upon myself, and to the point where I'm describing my own biases from that place. Now, we saw this in another sample earlier, and that was the TISC James Jean. So for example, here where James Jean talks about himself in the third person. Here, for example,
I think my emotional state is separate from the diligence I put into making my work. Because
so my emotional state is separate from the diligence I put into my work. He's, you know, speaking about his emotions as an object that he possesses rather than himself.
To be human.
To be human is also a depersonalization of oneself. To speak of oneself as a human, let's say.
So, you know, your body's just sort of this mechanical vehicle for your emotions, and you know, I keep trying to keep that vehicle operating.
Right. So you see here this again, the metacognition, the self-reflection, almost like observing yourself from this third-person perspective. It's similar to what the younger me is articulating here, talking about the biases that I apparently seem to have and can't get rid of. So that's interesting. So I'm going to add here third-person description of oneself. Perfect. Okay, so that's all the data we have on this video of a younger me. So we are seeing some connections between these three, again with the aforementioned privacy, but also a very cerebral focus. There's some inclination of focus on either philosophy or ideas, and the relevance of like the accuracy of ideas. In the case of Thales here, it's very much apparent that he wants to innovate in some way in refining how society views certain ideas. And with the younger version of me here, there's a focus on wanting to independently arrive at an accurate understanding, without being influenced so much from the outside. So there's some parity there between those two forms of thought. So now we're going to move on to our fourth sample, and this is Billy Doyle, who is a meditation practitioner. Again, disengaging eyes, meticulous hands, rigid posture, naive eyes.
Grasp of something beyond the material world.
A little bit of JE there, but
it wasn't that it was
retreating quickly again. Neutralization of affect.
By my parents or my schools. It was just
a little bit of casualness in the hands, but the body remains rigid. Disengaging eyes. Yep, very clear TiNE. And also a gentleman in later age. So you can see that, again, it's not age dependent. These Vultologies can span across all age ranges. Okay, so with him, I want to jump straight into his psychology because he has some very interesting things to say.
I think there was something in the child already that was already...
The child here being himself.
Had some intuitive grasp of something beyond the material world. And it wasn't that it was imposed on me by my parents or my schools. It was just something I think I felt inside.
Without being imposed upon by parents or anybody, he had, again, like the autonomous thought, he had a personal conclusion that seems to be innate to his childhood that he had. And that is that of that idea of some sort of transcendent reality. That is very similar to what I said above here all those years ago, saying that I felt as though I couldn't deny a certain kind of absolute reality being true, although in his case he called it a transcendent reality, but nevertheless the situation is similar. So the child, referring to himself, had a grasp of something beyond the material world, not imposed on him by parents or teachers.
That interest in otherness, in something beyond.
So interest in otherness and something beyond, okay? Now that externalness, otherness, something beyond, has some parity to something that exists outside of my mind, what I said here earlier, the younger me. And we even see a little bit of an echo of that in Isaac earlier, where he talks about how what he finds most beautiful is nature in a big way, but also feeling that there's something bigger out there from himself, something other than himself. And that has some parity with this third personness.
Stayed with me. I studied divinity at college, for example.
Studied divinity, okay.
I went to India when I was 20, 21. I worked with Mother Teresa.
Went to India. Now, when he talks about India here, he's a meditator. So he went to India specifically to meditate. So here, for example, you can see him doing some yoga stretches. And here you can see him in a meditative pose. And here you can see him leading out a class. And so actually, I'm going to add here meditation teacher, because that's one of the things that he does. He gives out classes.
But then the kind of, at that stage, the more Christian tradition faded away because the Indian tradition seemed to have a wider, more expansive background that I related to.
Right. So he left Christianity or Indian traditions, more expansive background. And actually there is some similarity between this and my own conclusions of Zen Buddhism. And so I also was a Christian originally up until the age where I let go of my own Christian beliefs at around the age of 18. And I arrived at something very similar to Zen Buddhism independently, and only to find out that, you know, it was already a system of thought that existed. And so I was very much ready to adopt it. So we see some parity there with Billy Doyle also moving towards more Eastern thought.
And so I guess in my mid-20s I heard about TM, Transcendental Meditation, and I started going to that. I immediately related to his approach, which was really listening to the body, letting it come alive as feeling, as energy, and working with that. It was a much more internal approach, meditative approach.
Listening to the body, taking a more internal approach.
That brought me to a deep understanding, I can say, a relaxed body, an understanding of what I'm not, a certain kind of freedom in my life, psychologically, and detachment.
So attaining freedom, understanding what I'm not, and detachment. And the detachment also has connections with the third person element, for example, of myself and also James Jean.
So there was, I was a happy human being. I wasn't not somebody who was suffering from crisis. And
I was a happy human being. The use of the term human being for oneself, it's very impersonal.
No, I was a happy human being. But there was always something more, I knew. For one thing, I was never comfortable being somebody. The personality.
I was never comfortable being somebody. The personality. That's also very impersonal, perhaps the epitome of impersonality.
One always felt there was an insecurity there, feelings carrying something. And I knew that this was something I had to free myself from. So as I say, it was a long, if you like, preparation. It didn't happen overnight. I think it rarely does. I think we have to be ready, we have to be mature, we have to be just ready to receive. And yes, it happened in a moment, that actual dissolving of everything that I had taken myself to be.
Dissolving of everything I had taken myself to be. Okay, so that brings us to the end of Billy Doyle and also concludes our view of the TiNe male examples. Now we're going to move on to analyze the TiNe female examples. Beginning here first with Bella, which is one of our volunteers. So this is the same Bella that we saw earlier in the series. So as you guys have seen already, there's a neutralization of energy, a flattening of the affect, a general poise receding.
Ultimately, I think
So, yep.
the answer is that
And also the zygomatic smile, as you can see, curtain effect, as well as the naive eyes, very doe-eyed, any eyes that are gently embedded. So since we've gone over her Vultology previously, now we're going to take a look at her psychology, and the first question that's asked here, it relates to what is her philosophy?
metaphysics and philosophy are different things. Well, philosophy can be a lot of different things.
So right there you already saw kind of making a distinction, which is part of this habit of like semantic clarification, which you're going to see a lot in TI users.
I mean, ultimately, I think the answer is that I really don't know. And that's because philosophy itself has its limitations.
So her philosophy is essentially, I don't know, because philosophy has its limitations.
Which is something I bring up a lot. And so while I use it as a tool to try to grasp at the truth, ultimately I acknowledge that it's a very limited tool, and which is a problem, but...
So philosophy is a very limited tool. Now we saw something like this articulated previously by Michael Huemer, if you remember, in the previous lecture. We talked about how he says here that you may not find the truth of philosophical issues. Like if you go into philosophy, you won't find the truth, but you'll at least have a view that is coherent, and maybe you can be less wrong. So this comprehension that philosophy itself is not the answer giver, but it's itself kind of a useful tool, is something that Michael Huemer articulated, and it's also something that we're seeing here articulated by Bella.
I think one of the conclusions I came to in the last year is something we talked about, and that's the idea of instrumentalism. And I think I pretty much feel that I know, as far as knowing goes, that most things humans do are instrumental.
Most things humans do are instrumentalist. So by the way, instrumentalism is defined here as a pragmatic philosophical approach with regards to activities such as science, law, or education, chiefly as an instrument or tool for some practical purpose rather than in more absolute or ideal terms. And so instrumentalism is a sort of philosophical position one might arrive at after having sought for sort of absolute knowledge or absolute concepts, only to be left with kind of a vacuum, which is just filled with more contingent truths after a reductive process of eliminating any candidates, as it were, for absolute truth.
Which is a little bit similar to what I said before about not knowing, but it's more like, because we don't know, we're using everything is basically an instrument to get there. So that makes everything not it, not the the thing we're aiming to understand.
So that makes everything not it, the thing we're aiming to understand, right? The it here would be that kind of capital T truth.
So yeah, I would say I know that everything is instrumental, and when I say everything, I mean whether it's human customs, whether it's like social structures that humans have, whether it's even science to a degree is using a lot of metaphors to get to a deeper truth about the world.
Human customs, social structures, and even science are using metaphors.
So language itself is a tool.
Language itself is a tool. Yeah, this is very interesting, right? Because we also saw, again, with Michael Huemer above, similarly thinking about how, let's say, for example, language gives us direction for assigning prepositions as meanings of sentences. This idea is similar to the one that Bella's articulating. And so remember when I said in the last lecture that Michael Huemer has a specific sort of psychology which we'll go over with the TiNEs. Well, here are the TiNEs, and here we're seeing the similarities. And what this is, what Michael Huemer had in this video, was high TI access. But that same high TI access is being seen much more regularly with the TiNEs. And so if you see TiNEs like Bella here is very much focused on this same sort of reductive thinking that tries to like get into the weeds of the fundamentals of concepts and kind of like tease apart the fundamental grammar, the fundamental semantics of what ideas are essentially, and critique them to the point of almost falling apart. And in the case of Bella here, being left with an I don't know at the end. That's very much a motif that we're seeing shared here between these two. So continuing.
Yes. It saddens me.
Yes, it saddens me. She was asked, does that sadden you? The I don't know, the not having anything that is it. Right?
And because in a way it makes everything fake to a degree. And it's taken me a while to accept that and play along with it, because I don't like that idea of things not, things just being an instrument to get to something else.
Okay, so it saddens me. It makes everything feel fake to a degree. It's taken a while to play along with this idea. So now this last part of what she said is very interesting because it's not the conclusion that she would have wanted to come to, but yet in some ways she is obliged to stay in this position even though it's not the one that she would want, which also has some overlap with this sort of otherness, holding oneself to ideas that are maybe not identical with oneself. So putting oneself aside in a way similar to how James Jean puts aside his emotion seems to be what's happening here. So that has parity with this third person detachment. So we see some of that here with Bella. And so Bella fits very squarely into this philosophical shade of TiNe that we're seeing here. Okay, so moving forward, we're going to see some other shades of TiNe because not all TiNes have an inclination towards philosophical ideas and rationality. Of course, there are other shades. So we're going to see here in this next sample an artist. So this is Cecily Brown.
The work gets more abstract when there is no body. There's kind of no.
Okay, so rigid posture.
I need the body as a kind of.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind
the pausing momentum halting of JI. And here in the close-up, you can see the eyes, you can see the concerned scowl of SI, also the naive, gentle embedding of NE. And more clearly, you can see here the lack of tension around the nose. Yeah, so very alpha appearance here and very JI appearance here. So that would be TiNe. So let's listen to what she has to say about her art. By the way, this is her art in the background.
The work gets more abstract when there is no body. There's kind of no substance. I need the body as a kind of vehicle to talk about being alive.
The work gets more abstract when there is no body. I need the body as a vehicle to talk about being alive.
You know, to understand the world in a way, to like, it's kind of like needing something to hold on to, you know, it's the meat, the flesh of, you know, of life that one wants to be engaged with.
Her artwork is very, very abstract. Let me show you. You can see her here with her paintings behind her. And as you can see, they're very chaotic and colorful, but there is some structure within them if you look closely. And that structure, as you can see here, has some elements of the human form. For example, here you can see some hands, legs, eyes. She needs to have some of that human form in the painting in order to not lose itself in a completely abstract work. And so she's describing here how adding the human body in some capacity kind of reintegrates the painting back into a relevance to us. So that's what she's talking about here. And as you can see here in the background, you can also see legs and human bodies. So I'm just going to add here artist, abstract painting.
Very much that chance element. For example, it would be very boring to me to work out a composition before I started and then just paint it.
So she very much likes adding that chance element. Rather than just knowing a composition beforehand.
The element of surprise has to be there. I really like to sort of contradict myself and not let it all go too pleasantly in one direction.
Okay.
If something seems to be unfolding too easily, I'd like to disrupt it. It disturbs me too much. I have to sort of break it down. I'm far more interested in a moment where figuration breaks down. I usually describe it as breaking down rather than becoming more abstract.
Breaking down figuration. If you watch more videos of her, you'll see she talks much more about this concept of teetering on the edge of unrecognizable. If she starts to draw and it becomes too realistic in the sense that you can tell what exactly everything is, she avoids that until it can have multi-meaning.
I think I'm constantly trying to balance, you know, make sure, you know, I don't mind the little dog peering over the wall, but I want it to shift and change into something else. But the little dog peering over the wall is there. I mean, often when I'm often hesitant because someone might say that they see certain things in a painting.
So avoiding clear single meanings in a painting, allowing for multiple interpretations. And if I may add a note here, what she's doing here is in some ways part of the any psychology that she has, which likes this kind of hodgepodging and also multi-meaning, and also enjoys this element of surprise. She wants it to be to where if you view it the next day or the next week or the next month, it might be different. And that's one of the only ways that, you know, she can ensure that her paintings remain interesting forever. But interesting in this case is this kind of novelty element that you continue to reimagine or reinterpret it as you see it. And also, if you think about it, even though this is paint, this is not philosophy, there is a little bit of that relativism in her approach to art as what we see in the more philosophical types above. For example, when Bella says that she doesn't know fundamental answers and that there are instrumental ways of things for working, if you translate that into art, you get something like Cecily Brown, where she doesn't have a canonical fixed view of what the painting should be like, and it allows for diverse interpretations of the work. So I just thought that was an interesting connection there, although by no means the only way to look at it.
When you push it, sometimes you lose it. So, but a good friend of mine, the painter Charlene von Hale, has this expression about take no prisoners. You have to go into it with this take no prisoners attitude, whether you're just starting or very near the end. You have to be able to risk losing it.
So struggles to know when an art piece is done, but also, you know, she takes no prisoners, as she says. So that's Cecily Brown here, quite different from the TiNes above, although not fully different, but definitely fits the JI lead painter motif, because we saw a JI lead artists such as James Jean, we saw Yayoi Kusama, and we saw Marina Abramovich. So there's no reason why the TiNe would be an exception to that. And following that same line of logic, we have here our next sample, which is Cosmo. All volunteered, so thank you, Cosmo, also for your video. Again, disengaging eyes, neutralization of affect, very, very clear any brushstroke eye toggles. But we've covered the Vultology pretty well already, so let's focus on the psychology here.
Expressing myself through art is always very empowering.
Expressing myself through art is always very empowering.
Relaxing, and made me feel good and confident because I was pretty decent at it.
Okay.
I also really enjoyed anything to do with language, so writing or English or even foreign languages I always enjoyed.
Okay.
I like that if I have a goal that I really want to achieve, I achieve it. I'm good at following through with that sort of thing.
If I have a goal I want to achieve, I achieve it.
I like that I'm open-minded in general. I usually try and take an objective, neutral standpoint on most things.
Try to be open-minded, taking an objective, neutral standpoint on most things. That neutrality has some echoes of what we talked about with the kind of detachment here, as well as the third personness here. This kind of attempt to be impartial.
Things and see the other points of view. Doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but it's still good to know all the different perspectives.
See all points of view, even if not agreeing with them. And, you know, part of that also echoes what we said earlier about the alpha conductors, right? That was the FESI and the SIFE. They also wanted to have what I called a diplomatic approach, to know and to balance as many perspectives as possible. And we can see that connected to some extent to, well, for one, any, which has a pluralistic perspective. It understands different points of view, and FE, which has an understanding of intersubjective realities.
It sharpens your own reason for why you believe a certain way and opens your mind up to new ways of thinking.
Sharpens your own beliefs. Okay, and that brings us to the end of Cosmo. And that completes our introduction to the TiNe Vultology. and it actually completes our introduction in general to the 16 types of Vultologies. So what did we see here? Well, like the other revisor types, there's also an inclination to have a kind of individualism, as we saw here with Frida, and being very consumed with one's own subjective experience. But the subjective experience and the consuming nature of the FINEs is very full of values, full of affects, full of contents, whereas individualism for the TiNe seems to be more about clarifying mistaken presuppositions. And in fact, there's a kind of removal of the self, a removal of one's own values and affects, and there's a form of detachment. And so that's what we're seeing here with the TiNe types. Now, one thing that I'd like to mention, even though it's not necessary for our CT understanding, is the matter of Albert Einstein and people also like Bill Gates, who in the Myers-Briggs system are typed as INTP, which is supposed to be the correlates to the TiNe type. But this is where I have to remind everybody that they're separate systems, and so what CT means by TiNe is not the same thing as the INTP. So as you might have noticed, I didn't mention Albert Einstein in the samples. He's not one of them. And that's vultologically, but also psychologically. And so, although I'm not saying that TiNes can't do the things that Albert Einstein does, a lot of the way that systems like the Myers-Briggs type people is based on the things that they achieve. And so geniuses and people they're very brainy people are given the title of INTP almost kind of by default tautologically. And so you have this assumption of high IQ essentially with INTP, which is a wrong merging of things to have. The samples that we saw here, what's similar to them isn't high IQ, isn't high competence in maths. It's actually just like an obsession with having conceptual purity in whatever they engage in. That could be mathematical, but it could also just be philosophical. And largely it's philosophical, largely it's existential, largely it's Platonic. And so what you see here is more of a desire to have pure descriptions, clear descriptions that are impersonal and just kind of timelessly true. And that is a different motivation than what we see with people like Bill Gates. So math equations, physics equations, and computer languages, that is something that's associated with the INTP, but that's not actually what we see associated with the Vultology that I call withholding. These are, in CT's language, these are object relations. They are object to object calculations. So in CT, what you see here with math equations and physics is not fundamentally different in form to, let's say, an economist, checking their different graphs and charts. So these are more prototypically TE behaviors, which are focused a lot on the economy and numbers and so forth. So focusing on the way math and numbers interact with one another is not itself a conversation about the accuracy of fundamental tautological semantic categories, statistical methods, graphs, charts, languages, and maths. That's already an externality. That's already a system that has cogs and wheels and levers and pulleys. Whereas the questioning of the very system, the essential criticism of the fundamentals by which you treat information, that is different than any system in particular. But perhaps in the future, we'll have more time to talk more about the difference between what CT means by TI and what other systems mean by it. But anyhow, that concludes this lecture. And the next one, which is going to be the final one, is going to be perhaps arguably the most important one of all, which is where we put everything that we've gone through in all this series together and then finally extract out the meaning. What does it mean that we're seeing this motif matrix? What does it mean that these different sorts of behaviors and psychologies are aggregating in a symmetrical fashion across the Vultologies that we're measuring? And what can we theorize might be responsible for this, which is the metabolism. And so we're going to start to unpack and build the metabolism of CT from the evidence that we've gathered so far. So I'm really excited to show you guys that. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope I see you guys in the next video.